Okay, so um, yeah, this is my talk on being the jack of all pipelines, um, and why, why that would not be a good thing, but mostly why it is a good thing. Um, so you've all heard the saying. It goes, well, it's basically, oh my god, my mind has just died. Being the jack of all trades means you're a master of none, but you're still always better than a master of one. Which essentially means it's really good to be all rounded and have more knowledge in lots of little areas than not know anything about anything else, but be really specialist. Um, so, what I'm going to cover today is first of all, I'm going to start with a little bit about me, um, and then go through the differences between indie versus AAA, um, how all of this applies to your job, regardless of what kind of art you're going into, whether it's tech art, concept art, whatever it is in games. And then I'm going to walk through how that affected my journey through becoming a concept artist slash game artist, and sort of developing even through that even further as new technology comes in, and yeah, picking your forte and becoming a jack of all pipelines. So, a little bit about me is I recently graduated from staffs. I think there's some people that probably know me and who are watching right now. And I started working at somewhere called Manor Point on a game called Dragginz part time while I was actually still in my third year. And that was a lot to take on, and they did allow me to pause towards the end when we had final deadlines. But I now work full time for them remotely, and it's absolutely amazing, and I'm loving it. And my job is technically called game artist, although they did hire me knowing that I had a degree in concept art. So I do get to do kind of both roles at once, which is really fun and definitely is a lot to learn, but also it helps switch it up. And it very, very nicely ties into the fact of this being about the jack of all pipelines. Um, yeah, I really love my team. It's amazing. And for anyone who's still kind of studying and not in the workplace yet, keep pushing through because it's amazing and it's so fun all the time. And at the moment, I'm currently in the middle of moving out, so I'm super busy with that as well. So absolutely crazy life. Yeah, let's get started with the next sort of actually wrapping around this topic. So when you're comparing indie versus AAA and where you want to specialize or sort of be very adaptable across different places, there's quite a big difference there. So when it comes to indie, they are more likely to focus on developing you as a person. They want to invest in the person that's coming. Um, so if you're employed in indie companies, they will sort of tailor things to you a little bit and they're always there to support you. They want to help you learn through it, through everything. And in my experience, you get really close communities, not just within your sector, but across different disciplines as well. Whereas in AAA, my understanding is more that they hire the best people possible and you're very specialist and you will stick kind of in your area. And they more hire the people to fit the projects and keep it more strict. Um, and then, of course, you have what I mentioned before, which is high adaptability versus heavy specialization. Ties in very closely to what I just said with in indie, you will likely be working on multiple disciplines at once, similar to myself, where you have, you know, concept art and game art sort of blending together, and potentially even game art and animation if you're more on the sort of later end of that. Um, so yeah, you're going to be learning lots and lots of different skills, and you want to be learning over a broad range really. Um, and you're still going to be learning if you go into AAA. Whatever you do, you're going to be learning on the job, and I think that's absolutely fantastic and one of the most interesting parts about working in art in games. Um, But yeah, the heavy specialization in AAA is more about how once you're in your area, you're going to be really honing in on that niche. You're going to be learning all the little tips and tricks to really optimize everything and, well, essentially specialize very heavily. So it's different in terms of what you're learning while you're working in that. Um, but yeah, it's I personally, as I mentioned, work in an indie company. It's very, very small. So I do multiple things and I'm more adaptable. Um, in terms of that, again, in the next point, you're gonna be focusing on building multiple separate skill sets in indie, and then, as I mentioned, optimizing really everything in AAA, making everything as fast as possible. And yeah, again, I think I've mentioned all this very quickly, all in one go. You're more likely to be, say, like in contact and socializing with the whole team, or at least a big chunk of it in indie, because you are working cross discipline a lot of the time. So I'm in contact very often with sort of the tech leads and stuff, especially tech art, where it sort of blends across. Even though I mostly do concept art in the early stages of game art. Whereas in AAA, you are usually in a big team of more specialized people, and you're more working within your sector and within the people in your sector. And the leads will be communicating more with the other areas. So it's a little different in terms of how you communicate with people, but you'll always have people around you to help you learn whichever area you're in. So your job, regardless of what kind of artist you are, is to communicate visually to both the customers and the other departments. People don't necessarily know why something looks good when you make it, regardless of if it's a sketch or if it's a finished piece. That is your job to know all the ins and outs of why something works, and obviously that's going to help you in the designing process of finding what they're looking for, even when they don't necessarily know quite what they want. Um, you still obviously need skills to, people skills to discuss ideas and develop them with your team and discuss it all. But equally, your designs should be able to speak for themselves and give across the vibe. As you can see, my little doodles from last night, very, very quickly done on the screen there. Um, they all kind of have different personalities and they're all adorable, but it's things like shape language, which some people are not aware of if you've not really gone into art much, and it can make a huge difference. Um, and even things like wear and tear levels later on when you're doing more detail, texturing, it's your job to know where to have those sort of areas of rest and those areas of detail to make it nicely balanced, but still come across as whatever your lead is looking for. Um, but yeah, so your job is to communicate visually and know why it works. Um, so a little bit about my journey as becoming a concept artist slash game artist, um, working on Dragginz, and how I got here. So, um, even though I now work pretty much entirely digitally, whether it be sculpting or sketching, whatever it is, I actually started completely traditional and sort of through school and through art school. In summers, I was always like drawing or painting, doing pen work. It was all traditional, and all of those things build observational skills. Um, and when I mention that, it's not just being able to look at something and copy it one for one, but it's sort of learning how things work at the same time so that you can take that and build in your memory. It really is strange how much more you develop with what you're looking at and understanding the forms of things when you're doing things like studies, especially, as I say, with the traditional technique, because there isn't that undo button. So you have to commit to everything, it has to be more deliberate. And for me, when I came to university, I hadn't touched any of the software before, and that was a huge learning curve. Um, but it made it a lot easier that I had those observational skills from learning art traditionally. And I was able to apply that very quickly. So I wasn't learning everything all at once. Um, I already knew sort of the basics of how to put something together that looked nice, and it was more applying it to the new workflows that we were learning in digital softwares and sort of routes through creating a design. I definitely would recommend. I know a lot of people hate working traditionally, but if you just do a sketch with a pen or just refuse to use the undo button for a couple of sketches, I think it's really help help us build that sort of deliberate mindset where you're really thinking about everything you're drawing. And that goes all the way back to like doodling in your school planner, um, which was definitely something I got in trouble for. um, but yes, being able to plug in those skills to other areas is something that's really vital across everything we're going to talk about today in terms of conquering multiple pipelines and techniques and departments. It's really important that you have those observational skills because they do really apply to everything, regardless of how you learn them. Um, so yeah, I would say as well, I'm learning as much on the job as I did in uni in terms of the new pipelines are always changing and it's still the same case of applying those same skills in a new way. So definitely a huge part of where I am now is being a traditional artist. In terms of actually landing the job I work in now, um, so I mentioned before briefly, I work remotely. My art lead is actually in Vietnam, and he's amazing. And it sounds crazy because it's so far away, but I was very fortunate to have connections already. I still had to go through the process of the interviews and sort of prepping my CV and showing them that I am qualified, or at the time was very close to being qualified, for what they needed. Um, Having connections is a brilliant thing, and it will only ever boost your application. Although it's still not something you can ride on entirely, of course. Um, but essentially, what I've learned is through interview processes they've at that point already seen all of your work, and they are just wanting to see if you're really enthusiastic and if you love learning as you go and will be able to adapt to what they need. Because if you're at that point, they already know that you have the skills to make nice things, to make art. Um, so having those connections obviously boosts you in that sense, but they're really looking for someone who's willing to adapt and actually excited to as well, not just like, oh, I guess I will. um, and yeah, along with that as well, when I mentioned qualifications, um, a lot of people think they have had jobs as teenagers or whatever, and they think of them as unrelated work experience, which is just not the case. That doesn't really exist. So I worked in as an ambassador at the university. I ended up doing a lot of like the visiting departments, like visiting schools and tours, as well as like the events and stuff, which is all people related. And before that, I actually worked with children before I came to university as well in a nursery. And all of it, even though it might seem completely unrelated and kind of useless when you're thinking about going into art, you still need those fundamental people skills because the department is going to want to get on with you and be able to communicate with you, not just because they have to, but they're going to be stuck in a space with you or working on the same thing as you for a long time. They want to know that you're getting on with that. um but yeah, to recap, mostly I really enjoy my job and I love the whole process and learning and stuff through the whole way. Applying those skills has really helped in every single step of the way. And it helps you learn new pipelines um, all the way through. Oh my gosh, I've accidentally just closed it. There we go. But yeah, keep those observational skills going because that's something that I'm very like. It's something that I stand on as being the vital part of applying to everything. Um, so in terms of keeping up with sort of a moving industry, and sort of as I say, learning those new pipelines as you go, um, pipelines are always evolving on their own, regardless of new technology. But with new technology arising, um, they are changing even more and very quickly. And it's really important to stay up to date with that and to maintain that to keep your well-rounded skill set. You have to keep evolving with the industry, no matter how long you've been in it. And I think that it can be absolutely very scary, and a lot of people worry that um, it's taking jobs, especially with AI. Um, but I did want to mention quickly that like in the past this has happened, and when Photoshop came about, people were like, "Oh my gosh, layers are cheating. You have an undo button." And things like when you're unwrapping UVs in game art, there are now buttons that try and do most of that for you, even though they're not amazing. And you still have to have work. And the point of me saying that is that all of these things became mainstream and all of the jobs were still there. They were just all a bit different. And people had to adapt to that. And all the pipelines changed, but it's still there. And we are seeing a similar reaction to AI at the moment in art, and it's definitely, as I say, very intimidating. Um, and there are other aspects to it, but yeah, I'm going to go into that a little bit more briefly. So the pipeline in AI is still being developed. There isn't really a way to use it, and a lot of people are worried about it being unethical. Um, and there's a lot of things going around about stolen work, and it's absolutely an issue that needs to be solved. And I think that over time that will be um, restricted a bit more in terms of like making it ethical. But I just wanted to go over a few things like how how can you use it ethically and why would you want to use it in the first place. A lot of people think it's a speed thing, but speaking as a concept artist, it's actually not that much faster than if you're doing a few sketches. Say it takes me, say I'm doing a sheet of 20 sketches, and each sketch takes me 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, depending how much detail I'm going into and how specific I want to be. Um, and using AI, you'd think it comes up right away, and it does create art very, very quickly. But a lot of it doesn't really make sense. It's a very vibes based tool, um, but it's very good for early communication. So if you have a kind of rough idea in your head, but you don't know how to articulate it, it's very useful for having a fast tracked sort of semi rendered look, which is easier to communicate with people who are less artistically literate. And that might be if you're releasing some kind of concept art for people to get excited about your game, or if you have maybe a head of department um, who's looking over several departments actually and isn't as artistically literate as you who specializes more. It's much easier for them to understand it from a sort of finished picture than a quick sketch, even though you and your art lead might understand that perfectly. And I think sort of using it as a communication tool rather than a whole thing to replace your job is good because it's not as specific as when you're drawing. As I mentioned, it's very vibes based, which is a weird way to phrase it, but it kind of makes sense. Um, and it won't fill in all the gaps. You will still always be needed. But I think that's sort of where it has its place. I don't think it will be coming to sort of take your whole job, but I do think it's something that will change the pipeline and develop alongside us. Hopefully, as I say, it will become more ethical. And something I wanted to mention is how we use it as ethically as possible when working on Dragons. Um, so, as part of our workflow, we do use it sort of to communicate those ideas primarily. It can't do turnarounds by itself accurately, but we do use it, as I say, to communicate the ideas initially. We use it ethically by putting in our own sort of doodles and sketches, and it's sort of use our own art, and we'll blend it together and come out with something new, um, entirely using our own stuff. So it definitely has a place, and I think that the way we're using it is more ethical. But I can absolutely see where the concerns are. But yeah, just to show an example, here's a couple of the doodles from earlier, and I sort of ran them through with some of the stuff. And, you know, it came up with these cute little dudes, which I absolutely love. Um, and you can see where it was going. Um, and obviously it's still very sketchy, it's still very stylized, but it kind of fills in the gaps a little bit for someone who maybe doesn't see it the same way you do from just the sketch that's very flat and quick. So yeah, I do think it's going to be used more in the pipeline as a communication tool. Um, a lot of people are worried that people won't be needed and the job's going to be taken, which I did briefly mention before. And absolutely, the pipelines are just going to change. AI is nowhere near being able to make accurate turnarounds that can be translated into 3D for game artists. So a lot of the time they do need redrawing and you fill in the gaps. A lot of the time they have extra fingers or not enough fingers, things like that. So it's absolutely not able to take over a human's job. Um, yeah, it's just going to be part of the process. So, um, going back to being a jack of all pipelines, you are still going to be applying for specifically titled jobs, whether that be a concept artist or a tech art or game art, etc. Um, and as much as this whole talk is about learning a bit of everything, you are going to need a main focus most of the time. Um, but you might have noticed that in job listings, they will list multiple skill sets that you might not expect to be as important for that role, but it's still for some reason listed in the things you need for the job. And that is different. There's different reasons for that between indie and AAA companies. And you'll see like a lot of concept art jobs will list skills you'd expect for a 3D game artist. And game art might mention some skills and knowledge in animation even, sort of stretching it. And even in AAA, they want you to have those additional skills. They're not asking you to be a pro at all of it. They're just asking you to have a little bit of knowledge. Um, and so, the first thought is why on earth would they ask that? And in both cases, having a broader set of skills than what you immediately need for your job helps you to better inform your work before it's passed to other departments. And that can help optimize workflows and sort of speed everything up. As well as, it makes things run a lot smoother. You're not having to go back as many times to go, hey, this isn't working. So all the departments end up working a bit more like clockwork. Um, and it all sort of smooths it together if you have a bit of knowledge of where it's going. Um, and it's not a worry if you don't have all those skills. A lot of companies will help you learn those extra bits on the job. It's actually expected that you're going to continue learning on the job, regardless of how or where that may be. But yeah, so a good example is if you know a little bit about animation, if you're retopologizing, or any game artists who are listening right now will know that you have to have an awareness of how things are going to be bending and moving because you have to adapt for that, which is kind of part of your job anyway. But another example is like when you're working as a concept artist, even initially, knowing to space out things in a character's silhouette from the start, such as like if they had really long hair that's going all the way down their back, knowing to pull that away from the character's silhouette a little bit, if it's in a game especially, can make life easier down the line for people who are making it 3D and animating it, to avoid things like clipping when your character's moving around. So having a bit of awareness, no matter where you are in the pipeline, can really help to inform what you're doing for yourself and stop you from having to redo work, but also from the company's perspective, um, you'll be able to sort of preempt those things that could go wrong and avoid them a bit more, which is, of course, a very useful and convenient thing to be able to do. That being said, if you are working in indie or looking to work in more indie and have those sort of jobs that are across multiple disciplines, you're very likely to be able to be working in two different places a lot, like an equal amount. So, like myself, I do a fair chunk of concept, but also the 3D, and they sort of are very well balanced. It's not that I mostly do one or the other, and I do believe it's similar in most small settings. But yeah, in those cases, it's even more important, obviously, that you have an idea of the other pipelines because they are likely to want you to learn them in a little bit more depth than if you are specialized. Um, so yeah, that's something to absolutely bear in mind, and it's just interesting to learn as well. You should be interested to learn the other bits around why you're doing what you're doing and where it's going. Um, but yeah, when you are choosing your sort of main specialization, the only thing I can really say is make sure it's the one that you really enjoy most and it's something that you click with, because it's still likely to be your main focus, or at least one of your main focuses. And yeah, you need to enjoy it, regardless of what other pipelines you're learning alongside it. Um, and having those extra bits of knowledge is always just a bonus that's going to make you it's going to make you more employable and just a better artist, regardless of where you are sat in there. So, oh my gosh, this has gone way faster than I thought. In terms of actually becoming a jack of all pipelines, um, essentially it's entirely your ability to observe and communicate with people. Um, having those observational skills, as I said at the beginning, will help you build at every single stage, at every level. So those fundamentals that you learn right at the start, you should keep on practicing them and you should keep on applying them and consciously think back to them and why things are the way they are. Um, and yeah, and keep developing, keep up to date with everything. And again, always revert back at the same time. You should always be learning on the job. And as I said, that is completely expected and part of the fun. If you are someone who's really intimidated by how much there is to learn across everything, because I know that can seem like, oh my gosh, specializing is hard enough. I've learned so much. How are you going to say I need to learn everything else? Um, it is very intimidating, but the thing you want to pay attention to through everything is, again, developing those observational skills. And you don't need to become a master of everything. You only need to know a little bit of everything and then sort of be a master of just the one. Um, if that. um, it's, those observational skills are just the ability to be more intentional than just have an idea or a vibe. It's being able to apply everything and noticing the bigger picture as well as the smaller details. Um, it's things like doing studies that can be very boring, but those will work on your observational skills directly. And I think, as I mentioned multiple times, that is key to becoming a jack of all trades in this industry. But yeah, being able to communicate and developing those observational skills is just especially in these artistic disciplines, a whole part of the deal. It's something you should absolutely be doing. Um, I've done that in double speed. I've covered everything that I planned. Um, Thank you for listening.